Part 2. Peter lay on his back in the short, dry grass. The air was still with the stillness of late summer, when the earth has ceased pushing growth forth and is sunning itself, awaiting harvest. Distant, but not far, the sound of small hoofs could be heard as they went from one tuft of grass to another, and even the dull sounds of crunching and chewing came on the warm air. Good sounds they were that meant all was well with the flock. Peter looked up at the tree reaching skyward above him. From one of its low branches hung a dark brown coat, rough wool once, now worn smooth. The arms were wrinkled at the elbows. Something about them made Peter smile, for they looked so much shorter than his own arms. He rolled over in the grass to see what Benj was doing. The old man was sitting on a stone, gazing into space. Whenever he was not minding the sheep or doing some ordinary thing like eating or sleeping, he would be doing just that. It used to puzzle Peter once, but now it didn't. Benj. The old man turned his head to look at the boy. Peter nodded to his coat hanging on the limb above him. I'm thinking I'll need a new coat soon. Shearing time is a long way off. Peter sat up and, reaching for the coat, pulled it down. Then he put it on to prove his point. The sleeves were an inch above his wrists. The front where the buttons went was frayed. There was a patch over one hip. Across a shoulder, a rent in the cloth had been neatly joined together. There's wear in it still, Benj wagged his head sagely. And where there's wear in sheep's wool, there's warmth. It's served you well for 5 years. 5 years. Peter sat on the rock beside Benj and looked off into space. But it wasn't space. Only those who had never kept sheep on a hillside could think that it was. It was memory, filled with such good and lovely things that dwelling on them made them live again, almost as real, and sometimes even more wonderful. It was the time ahead, too, dreams of what the years might hold, all the good things which, if one cared enough about them, could be the only things. Benj had once said, "A man must have a care to what he puts in his mind, for when he's alone on a hillside and draws it out, he'll want treasures to be his company, not regrets." Benj, can you remember when my coat was new? Peter asked suddenly. Indeed so, Benj said, and a proper man you looked when you wore it on your first day off to school. The sleeves longer than your arms, and the bottom of it a good length too. Benj smiled as he thought of the fine figure Peter had made. And the smell of it, Benj, do you remember the smell of it? As rich and greasy as if it were still on Biddy's back, Peter laughed. Biddy was so surprised when she put her nose to it. She knew it was her wool. She did indeed. There's not much that sheep doesn't know. Peter thought back on those days, how the coat had kept the wind away from him and shed the rain when he walked back and forth to school, companioned by big thoughts as books opened up to him and words no longer looked like sheep tracks on a sandy road. And Benj, do you remember at the next shearing when Mary came to help? She had her woolen dress on, and Biddy's lamb followed her all over, for she seemed more like her mother than Biddy with her old fleece shorn. Peter rocked with laughter at the memory, and old Benj smiled. That patch now, Benj reminded him. I can see your mother putting it on. Peter felt for the patch and ran his hand over it. The coat had been so new then. It had been hard to keep the sadness from his eyes at the big ugly tear until his father told him it was a badge of honor. All good clothes wear such, or they aren't fit for much, his father had said. Peter had felt better at that and could bear without regret the patch his mother had put on. He could even bear to have others in his coat if they came honorably. It had been at the shearing that his coat had got torn. Peter was holding the forefeet of a sheep, while his father grasped the hind legs. Somehow the shears had slipped from the shearer's hands, and the force he put in them sent them across the sheep's smooth belly, pointing toward her neck. Peter had seen them, and, still keeping his hold on the slender, bony forelegs, had thrown himself across the sheep. The shears caught in his coat, ripping it jaggedly. You won't be forgetting the tear on your shoulder, will you now? Benj asked, his soft old eyes twinkling. Peter laughed. What a time they had had bringing the sheep down from the pasture that year. Instead of being docile and obedient, they were possessed and willful. Rollo did his best to check them, but different groups had persisted in getting off the road from time to time. Peter dived under a fence to head off 3 sheep from a farmer's new-sown winter wheat. A piece of wire had caught in his coat, and in his impatient need for freedom, he had fought it, ripping the coat and winning for it a doubtful badge of honor, and for his mother an evening of work with her sewing box under the lamp. That was a year they would not forget, for the sheep had been quite right in not wanting to leave their pastures. The valley people had misread the weather signs, and the sheep might have had all of another month in their high grazing. Peter liked remembering these things as he looked at his new coat, now so small and worn and battered-looking. It was as if it held in its pocket all the joys and hard work and deep satisfaction of these 5 years that had gone by. If Biddy would only have a ewe lamb, a black ewe lamb just like herself, Peter exclaimed. For though Biddy had had 3 lambs, each one had been white, and each one had been a ram that had gone off to the market town after the summer grazing was well over. Biddy's a smart one, Benj said. She'll have a ewe lamb all right one of these days. Then they fell to talking about the time just a few months ago when Biddy had shown her smartness as never before. Since then, old Benj would let no one speak of her except in a most respectful way. It was shortly after the sheep had been taken up to the hills for their summer grazing, and on the farm it was one of the busiest times of the whole year with the planting and sowing that was going on. Andrew and Benj and Peter had been working in the fields since early morning and had just come back to the house and drawn up their chairs to one of Martha's ample meals. There was a slight commotion outside. Rollo barked, but it was his bark of greeting, and no one thought a second time of it. The men took up their spoons and began eating. Martha said, "Dinner hour's a queer one for a caller, but whoever it is, there's plenty of food." The outer door was pushed open, and before anyone could rise from the table, in walked Biddy. She stood for a moment staring at them with her amber eyes that often looked as if they saw far beyond what was immediately present. Andrew was cross. "She's found a hole in the fence. Now the whole flock will be down here. And just the day when we've more work than we can do." "I made the fences good and strong," Benj said, puzzled by Biddy's appearance, but more puzzled by her strange stillness, her lack of any show of affection, her lack of any interest in food. "Something's wrong up in the hills," Martha remarked quietly. Peter slipped from his chair and took a potato from the dish to offer to Biddy, but her jaws were tight clenched. It was not food she had come for. Then Peter saw. He let out a sharp, frightened cry. There, where Biddy stood, a pool of blood was forming on the kitchen floor, dripping down her neck, matting in the thick wool, down a foreleg onto the floor. The others saw too and came and stood by the sheep. Benj felt with his hand all around her neck. "Is it a wire?" Andrew demanded quickly. Benj shook his head. "Teeth." The 2 men looked at each other. "Wolves or dogs gone wild," their eyes said, though no words left them. "Get the gun, Benj. Come along, Peter. We may need you. Some food, Martha. One of us may have to stay up there all night." Andrew had taken charge and was giving orders in the quick, stern way that was always his in an emergency. Biddy turned and went to the door. She had delivered her message. She would go back to her lamb. Benj took down the gun, which was handled on such rare occasions that it was filmed with dust. It had been years since it had been used to enforce death, as it would be now. Its main use had been to bring an easy end to the lengthy days of a faithful farm creature, or to one suffering past any hope of recovery. Benj shouldered it silently. Peter took the hastily put-together packet of bread and cheese from Martha, and then they were off. Biddy was well ahead of them on the road, but even were she not in sight, they could have followed her easily, for her little trail of red drops she left behind her. "She's bleeding sorely," Andrew said. "We should have tried to stop it." Benj shook his head. "She wouldn't have waited that long. She's got her mind set on her lamb." Peter said nothing, but a quiver went through him. He was proud of Biddy. proud because she had been his cosset and was now the smartest sheep in the flock. "The bleating is lessening," Benj commented after a while. And then, when they had nearly reached the pasture, he saw with satisfaction that it had ceased altogether. They never found how Biddy got through or over or around the miles of fencing that were meant to keep the pastures safe, but they found why. In a ravine, a clustered, frightened group of sheep were gathered, still trembling as they had when they had raced for their lives across the open land. Their wild eyes could not see the three approaching them as friends, but as something more to fear. At sight of Benj and Andrew and Peter, an anguished sound came from the flock, high and plaintive from the mothers, sharp and questioning from the lambs. Near the entrance to the ravine were the mangled bodies of 6 sheep who had not been able to flee. With long strides, Benj moved in among the flock, talking to them, reaching out his hands on either side to comfort and allay. Biddy had joined the flock, her dark brown fleece instantly discernible among the tawny coats. Somewhere she had found her lamb and was wickering over it, proud and happy. Her quietness and Benj's slow tones spread assurance to the flock, and gradually they became calm. Peter stayed with the sheep while Andrew and Benj went off across the pasture land and over the rounded knobs of hills, searching for traces of the invader, but they found none. When dusk began to settle down, Andrew and Peter started home. Benj was left sitting on a stone, the gun across his knees, Biddy and her lamb beside him, so the flock would not stray. Peter remembered him sitting there, as silent as a tree, as grim as a stone-laden east wind. He remembered, too, the long walk home. His father had been quiet, saddened by the loss of the sheep. Peter felt sad, too, as he thought of the cruel and bitter things that happened in the world, things that didn't need to happen and that upset the orderly pattern of their days. He buttoned his coat tight. The smell and the feel of it brought comfort to him. "How was it that night when you stayed alone?" Peter asked Benj. He had heard the story 100 times, but he had never heard it enough. "It was as still as most nights are, and there were as many stars in the sky, or maybe a few more," Benj began. "And I sat on the stone, and I sat. Now and then I'd feel the gun to see that it was all right, or I'd reach for Biddy to make sure she was still there." "Didn't you get sleepy?" "Maybe I did, but when need be, a man can sleep with his eyes open. Some of the stars went down and new ones rose. A wind came blowing over the hilltops, shaking out cold. The sheep stirred a bit, and then I knew, as sure as your eyes are on me now, that he was looking at me." "What did you do?" "No different than what I'd been doing for hours past. Sat and waited. I figured patience could outlast greed any time. Just before the dawn, when you could have heard the dew forming, it was so still, he came from behind the rocks. I let him get just so near the flock, the warm smell of them tickling his nostrils. Then I let go. The noise sent the sheep scattering, but the bullet got him clean." Peter shivered with the thrill of it. He remembered the next part of the story, how, when they were sitting at breakfast that morning, Benj had come in and nodded to them. Andrew smiled, and it was good to see the hard lines driven from his face. "Got him," Ben said. "What was it?" Andrew asked. "Wolf," Benj said. He hung the gun up and went to wash his hands. A look of relief came over him. He hated the gun, but when he had to use it, he could. He had no heart for killing, but if it was to save life, that was another matter. Benj sat down at the table and ate his breakfast, then went to his day's work as if he had not kept an all-night vigil. Since that time, the flock had been guarded. Peter and Benj had spent the whole summer up in the hills, and Andrew had hired another man to help him in the fields. They had made a camp for themselves, and once a week Benj had gone down to the valley to fetch back supplies. Peter had felt safe with Rollo to help him when he was left for a long day alone with the sheep. That was the way they talked during the long days up in the hills, remembering things, putting them together, listening and thinking and imagining. "You must have read books and books to know so many stories," Peter would say admiringly. Books, Benj echoed, and his soft eyes grew misty. We had a book in our home, and my father read to us every night after the supper. A book? Peter could not imagine a household with only one book. After all, even their little farmhouse had several, and there were houses down in the valley which had many books. Aye, a book, Benj repeated lovingly. Then Peter knew which book it was. You mean the one we hear read from at church on Sundays, he asked. Benj nodded. My father read from it every day. There are sheep in it, aren't there? Peter asked. Sheep aplenty, Benj answered, and a boy named David looking after some of them. David, Peter murmured. There was a boy in school named David. He felt as if he might almost know this other one. How old was he? Maybe about your age, 12 or a little older. He was a good-looking boy, ruddy-faced, and knew how to play a little harp that he took with him when he was out on the hillside alone with the sheep. But it wasn't always quiet on the hillside. Wasn't it? Benj shook his head. No more than it's always quiet here. One day a lion and a bear came along and took a lamb out of the flock. David went after them, and when he found the lion, he struck him hard and took the lamb out of his mouth. The lion was angry and turned on David, so David caught him by his beard and put an end to him right there. He finished up the bear, too, and carried the lamb back to the flock. Was the lamb all right? Benj thought for a moment. He was a bit frightened, for lambs have tender hearts, you know, but David put him to his mother, and the old ewe knew what to do to comfort him. What did David do then? He sat down on the hillside and picked up his harp. It had only a few strings, but they were enough, and as he played them, he made some pretty words to go along with the sound. That's a fine story, Benj. Tell me more about David. I will, for there's a lot to tell, but we've work to do now. They got up and went toward the flock, one on either side, as it was time for their daily gathering and counting. When they finished tending the sheep, an hour later, they went back to their camp. Benj built up the fire and started to cook their evening meal. Peter was still thinking about David. Benj said he had lived a long time ago, but there was nothing very different between his life and theirs. Peter said as much to Benj. Sheep haven't changed any all these years, said the old man mused, and their needs are still the same. Green pasture, fresh water, and a little extra care at the lambing. They give man the same good things, too. Warm wool and a stout hide and sweet, tender meat. Benj ladled something out of the pot he had been stirring into Peter's plate. Then he poured out a mug of fresh ewe's milk for the boy. 3 things I've heard tell best support the world, he went on. The slender stream of milk from a cow's udder into the pail, the slender blade of green corn from the ground, and the slender thread over the hand of a skilled woman. The words fell quietly on the evening, and through them Peter saw his father milking in the warm barn, his father plowing and planting and watching the seeds sprout. Then he not only saw, but almost heard the whir of the spindle as Mary's granny spun the rough sheep's wool into fine thread. Biddy came near them, her white ram lamb beside her. With Peter between her and the fire, she tucked her legs under her and settled down. Peter nestled up against one side of her, and the well-grown lamb was not far from the other side. Darkness came down, and the fire made only a smoke glow in it. The day's end was near. Work was over, now rest was at hand for man and creatures. Peter drew his blanket over him and looked at the stars coming out slowly in the sky. Here with the earth beneath him, the heaven above, he felt like a tree with its roots in the soil and its branches reaching skyward. Wind and rain, stars and sun, his comrades, and a flock of sheep his care. Benj, grazing into the fire, was talking softly to himself. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. The words long loved fell from his lips, as thoughts long harbored kindled anew within him. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Quietly, he got up and put more wood on the fire. Then he made his rounds. The flock were all together, asleep or chewing their cud. As he went among them, they made small sounds of trust. They were safe. They had been safe all summer, yet Benj had a feeling that the hills were not safe. Often at night, a low, wailing sound that was wind or wild one would come mutedly on the air. And often in the daytime, tracks that were not those of a sheep would be found by some watering place. But there had been no trouble. None of the flock had been molested. Still, it was all the same, that strange foreboding. Coming back to the fire, Benj straightened Peter's blanket and tucked it around his legs. He stroked Biddy's head for a moment, and from deep within her came that low, affectionate rumble, rarely heard save when a ewe first stands over her lamb. But it was Biddy's special language for the humankind she loved. Benj stretched out by the fire, then looked up at the sky with its sprinkling of stars. He had one prayer, prayed as long as he could remember, and in it he asked no blessing or protection. "Thank you, God," he said, and his voice was like Biddy's in its rumbling tenderness, for another day. To Benj, life was a journey heavenward, and each day was a step toward that whole of goodness which he knew now in part. He closed his eyes, and sleep drew around him like a light curtain. A smile bent its bow across his lips. He loved his simple life, unchanging greatly from day to day or year to year, except as the flock grew and the new lambs replaced the older sheep, a life that bound him to the creatures in his care and helped him to understand them.